The United States and a coalition of Native American tribes led by Black Hawk, a Sauk warrior and leader, fought a short but crucial war in 1832. Of course, due to this leader, we call it the Black Hawk War. It demonstrated the fierce opposition to westward expansion and was brought on by contested land treaties and the U.S. government's attempts to drive the native tribes from their ancestral lands in Illinois and Wisconsin. As for Black Hawk, him and his supporters fought a string of skirmishes and battles against the American militia forces in an attempt to retake their lost homeland. The Battle of Bad Axe, where the Native American coalition was ultimately overpowered by the superior numbers and resources of the Americans, and the Battle of Stillman's Run were significant engagements which we will talk about shortly. After Black Hawk's forces were eventually routed at the end of the war, Native American tribes were forcibly removed, and the territory of the new United States began to grow. Native American displacement, the influence on U.S. frontier policies, and the lasting legacy of Black Hawk is that symbol of tenacity and resistance that are the main reasons why the Black Hawk War is remembered. Of course, we're going to learn all about them today. Welcome to the channel, everybody. A little bit more U.S. history today, and I have made mention that I am quite enjoying it. A little bit of a different area. It's good fun. Of course, if you like this sort of thing, well, you better share the joy. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your neighbors. Like, subscribe, do all the rest, but most importantly, get relaxed because we now begin. The Sauk and Fox tribes, being known as the Meskwaki tribe, Fox being their word for it, lived along the Mississippi River in what is now the region of Illinois and Iowa during the 18th century. Their homeland's fertile soil, prime hunting grounds, access to lead, and water routes for trade made it highly prized. These two tribes, each displaced from the Great Lakes by conflicts involving New France and other native nations, especially during the Fox Wars of the early 1700s, formed a strong alliance together, pooling up their resources, trying to survive. By the time of the Black Hawk War, they numbered a decent 6,000 people. Early in the 19th century, as the United States began to expand westward, government agents attempted to purchase the native lands. In 1804, Territorial Governor William Henry Harrison negotiated a treaty in St. Louis with a small group of Meskwaki and Sauk leaders, supposedly selling the land east of the Mississippi for $2,200 worth of goods, plus an annual $1,000 in goods to be paid once a year. The treaty stirred, well, more than a little bit of controversy, because the tribal councils had not formally authorized this succession. In fact, it's believed that the Native American leaders never intended to part with so much valuable territory for so little, and that the Americans quietly broadened the treaty's land boundaries, little by little, piece by piece, as if no one would notice. Under its terms, the Sauks and Meskwakis were allowed to remain on the ceded land, at least temporarily, at least until it was eventually sold to settlers. And so, for 2 decades, most Sauks continued living at Saukenuk, near the confluence of the Rock and Mississippi rivers. But in 1828, the U.S. began surveying this land for sale, and Indian agent Thomas Forsyth ordered the Sauks to immediately abandon Saukenuk. The tribe was divided. A majority chose not to fight and simply moved to the west of the Mississippi under the orator Keokuk, who had led Saukenuk's defense in the War of 1812, but believed resisting the United States at this point was a futile venture. American officials, eager to avoid conflict, showered Keokuk with gifts, encouraging him and his followers to leave. About 800 Sauks, roughly about a sixth of the tribe, decided to stay behind, determined to fight the American encroachment, determined to fight for their way of life. And their leader was Black Hawk. Not a young man, perhaps not as energetic as you might have assumed, but definitely with the spirit to match. In fact, he was 60 years old at the time, a war captain who had fought the United States in that War of 1812. Though not a civil chief, Black Hawk challenged Keokuk for influence. He had signed an 1816 treaty reaffirming the 1804 cession, but claimed the Americans wrote down different terms than what had been agreed upon orally. In his words, and I quote, "The whites were in the habit of saying one thing to the Indians and putting another thing down on paper." Black Hawk had been born in Saukenuk, and he refused to relinquish it. In 1829, after a winter hunt, his followers returned to find white squatters already occupying part of the village. Of course, this was not the surprise they wanted. "Who's been sleeping in my bed? Who's been eating my porridge?" Seeking to avoid constant feuds, Keokuk told Forsyth that he would not return to Saukenuk. In the spring of 1830, however, Black Hawk's group went back against Keokuk and Forsyth's advice. They were joined by over 200 Kickapoos, longtime allies, and began calling themselves the British Band, because they occasionally flew the British flag to challenge U.S. sovereignty and hoped to secure British support from Fort Malden in Canada. I mean, it's an interesting strategy. They would have never been in that situation if not for British colonialism in the first place, but, well, it is what it is, I suppose. So by 1831, Black Hawk's British Band had actually grown to about 1,500 people, and that includes some Potawatomis allied with the Sauks and Meskwakis. American officials were, of course, determined to expel them from Illinois. General Edmund P. Gaines, commander of the U.S. Army's Western Department, mustered militia cavalry under Governor John Reynolds to ensure the band could not simply move farther inland on horseback. About 1,500 volunteer militiamen responded. Meanwhile, Keokuk convinced many of Black Hawk's supporters to leave Illinois for safer ground across the Mississippi. On June 25th, Gaines sent troops to Vandriff Island, which is opposite of Saukenuk, where a farmer had provoked Black Hawk by selling liquor to his followers. The next day, the militia tried to assault Saukenuk but found it abandoned. Black Hawk and his people had again retreated west. On June the 30th, Black Hawk and other tribal leaders signed an agreement with Gaines, pledging to remain west of the Mississippi and refrain from contact with British agents in Canada. But late that year, the Sauk civil chief, Neopope, returned from Fort Malden in Canada, claiming the British and other Illinois tribes would support Black Hawk in their fight against the Americans, though these rumors proved to be exactly that, rumors unfounded. Black Hawk thus spent the winter trying to recruit more allies, including from Keokuk's faction, but he met with quite little success. Neopope also claimed that Wabokieshek, the Winnebago prophet, had promised backing from other tribes. Wabokieshek, whose father was from a Sauk civil leadership clan, and mother was Ho Chunk, Winnebago, did join the British band, but generally cautioned against armed conflict with the United States. His village, Prophetstown, lay about 35 miles up from Rock River and Sauk, housing roughly 200 people. Ho-Chunks, Sauks, Meskwakis, Kickapoos, and Potawatomis, angry at tribal leaders who refused to resist American expansion. So on April 25th, 1832, Black Hawk's band of about 500 warriors and 600 non-combatants re-entered Illinois near the Iowa River's mouth, heading north. But we must say, historians do disagree on his precise aims. There's a few that suggest that he planned to settle near Prophetstown, others saying that he intended to reclaim his ancestral home of Saukenuk. But it was possible that he was unsure himself exactly of what aim. Either way, he was up to something. While U.S. authorities urged Wabokieshek to turn Black Hawk away, the prophet believed the Americans would permit a peaceful settlement if local tribes and the British supported the band. Black Hawk likely wanted to avoid war. The inclusion of women, children, and elders indicates that it was not a conventional war party, not out to raid or anything, just a bunch of people trying to find a home. I'm sure you understand. At the time, American officials were actually more concerned about the conflict among the region's native tribes than they were about the British band's return. You see, that wasn't the only thing that was going on. It's a big country with a lot of frontiers, you see. Many histories focus, however, solely on Black Hawk's clash with the United States, but it somewhat overlooks an ongoing intertribal rivalry that predated and intersected with the Black Hawk War. You see, things were not all peaceful and hugs and kisses before the arrival of the colonists. No. Wars and tribes were always doing what they do best. For years, tribes along the upper Mississippi had wrestled over these diminishing hunting grounds. Well, you see, following the War of 1812, with Britain no longer the dominant foreign power, the United States became the principal mediator in these regional disputes. In the 1820s, U.S. officials aimed to minimize these intertribal warfares, believing it complicated the Indian removal process that favored relocating the tribes west. Treaty councils at Prairie du Chien in 1825 and 1830 attempted to impose tribal boundaries, which some native warriors resented. Of course they did. You see, for them, waging war was a key path to prestige. How else are you going to earn those feathers? Thus, the Black Hawk War not only pitted Black Hawk's band against American troops, but also reignited these internal tribal tensions under the broader shadow of this U.S. expansion. All very complicated, I know. So the American spoils system complicated matters further when Andrew Jackson became president in 1829. Skilled Indian agents, including Thomas Forsyth, were replaced by inexperienced loyalists like Felix St. Vrain. There was a bit of argument, however, regarding if Forsyth had remained the Sauk's agent. The Black Hawk War might have been prevented. Well, maybe. Efforts to curb intertribal warfare, however, faltered in 1830. At the Treaty Council in May, Dakotas and Menominee killed 15 Meskwakis at Prairie du Chien. In July of 1831, Meskwakis and Sauks struck back, killing 7 Menominee. Killing 26, rather. Excuse me. Though American authorities persuaded the Menominee not to seek revenge, their western bands joined the Dakotas in attacking the Sauks and Meskwakis. To avoid a broader conflict, U.S. officials ordered the army to arrest the Meskwakis who killed the Menominees. When General Edmund P. Gaines fell ill, Brigadier General Henry Atkinson took command. An officer with strong administrative experience, but no combat background, Atkinson left Jefferson Barracks on the 8th of April, 1832, heading upriver with 2,200 soldiers, completely unaware that Black Hawk's British band had just crossed into Illinois. You can see where all this is going. Arriving at Fort Armstrong on April 12th, Atkinson learned that the Meskwakis he sought were now with Black Hawk's band. Convinced the group intended war, he had few troops and turned to Illinois' Governor John Reynolds, who was eager to remove all native people from the state by any means necessary. The foreboding report from Atkinson on April 13th brought 2,100 militia volunteers to Beardstown by April 22nd, forming a brigade under Brigadier General Samuel Whiteside. One of these volunteers, 23-year-old Abraham Lincoln, became a military captain. It's him. I know, right? Well, despite emissaries from Atkinson, Keokuk, and the Meskwaki chief Wapello urging a withdrawal, Black Hawk simply refused to turn back. Colonel Zachary Taylor later claimed Atkinson should have acted more decisively, while some historians argue in hindsight better diplomacy or a stronger show of force might have ended things peaceably. Others note that both Black Hawk's warriors and militiamen were primed for a fight, making bloodshed almost an inevitability. Either way, Black Hawk found little support from the Ho-Chunk and the Potawatomi. Their various bands adopted differing stances. Some in Illinois cautiously backed the British band, but tried avoiding outright war with the U.S., while others in Wisconsin, recalling defeat in the 1827 Winnebago War, completely stayed out of the conflict in any regard. Some Ho-Chunk, like Wakon Decora, with Menominee ties, wanted to fight the British band head-on. For the Potawatomis, mistrusted by settlers since the 1812 Fort Dearborn massacre, neutrality was difficult. Leaders feared that if any Potawatomis joined Black Hawk, the whole tribe would be punished. At a May 1st council near Chicago, Billy Caldwell and others proclaimed that any Potawatomi siding with Black Hawk would be branded traitors. In mid-May, the chiefs Shabona and Wabonsi told Black Hawk neither they nor the British would be giving him any assistance. So, without sufficient provisions, British supplies, or native allies, Black Hawk knew that his big band was in big trouble. According to some reports, he was prepared to engage Atkinson in negotiations to resolve the conflict, but a disastrous run-in with Illinois militiamen would eliminate any chance of a peaceful conclusion in that regard. In late April, General Atkinson mustered General Samuel Whiteside's militia brigade into federal service at Rock Island. It was split up into 4 regiments, led by Colonels John DeWitt, Jacob Fry, John Thomas, and Samuel M. Thompson, as well as a scout or spy battalion under James D. Henry, with Judge William Thomas serving as their quartermaster. On April 27th, Atkinson had told his least disciplined and well-trained men to move upon the Indians should they be within striking distance without waiting for my arrival, while he led the rear with the regular soldiers, allowing Reynolds, Whiteside, and the militiamen to depart up the Rock River. General Reynolds served as a major general of the militia and accompanied the expedition. About 35 miles from where they began at the confluence, the militia marching up the Rock River to pursue the British band arrived at Prophetstown on May 10th. Instead of, however, waiting as Atkinson had planned, they set fire to the deserted village of White Cloud, and then moved about 40 miles upriver to Dixon's Ferry, where they awaited Atkinson and his soldiers. The wary white side insisted on waiting for Atkinson at the settlement, despite Reynolds' desire to let the 260 eager militiamen who had not yet been federalized to continue on as scouts. In fact, Ogie, who was half native, founded Dixon's Ferry in 1826, with a wagon trail that connected Peoria to the lead mines in Galena across the Rock River. Settlers built cabins at the crossing and along the Peoria-Galena trace, and by 1829 the post office was serving settlers as far up the river as Rockford. Eager to confront Black Hawk's band, Major Isaiah Stillman led a group of volunteers out of Whiteside's camp on May 12, 1832, setting up near a Rock River tributary later called Stillman Valley. Acting without orders, Major Samuel Hackleton and some other men chased a group of natives flying a red flag, killing one of them. Unaware that Black Hawk was nearby, Stillman's party was surprised at dusk on May 14 in what became known as the Battle of Stillman's Run. But of course, accounts vary. They always do. Black Hawk had claimed that he had sent emissaries under a white flag who were detained and fired upon, while militiamen insisted they never saw any kind of true signal. Well, either way, Black Hawk's 40 warriors routed Stillman's larger force, killing 12 militiamen and losing only 3 of their own. The clash solidified the war on both sides. There was really no turning back now. Shocked at Stillman's defeat, U.S. officials, President Andrew Jackson, and War Secretary Lewis Cass included, dismissed diplomacy, hoping a swift victory would deter future native uprisings. Realizing that he had few allies, however, Black Hawk moved non-combatants, women, children, and elders upriver to a sheltered Ho-Chunk area called the Island on Lake Koshkonong in the Michigan Territory. Meanwhile, his warriors, joined by some Ho-Chunks and Potawatomis, launched raids against the settlers. Although Potawatomi Chief Shabono attempted to warn settlers, the violence still spread. Ho-Chunks initiated the first raid on the 19th of May, killing William Durley near Buffalo Groves, Illinois. Not long after, Indian agent Felix St. Vrain and 3 others were attacked and mutilated at Kellogg's Grove. Sometimes these raids arose from personal grievances rather than loyalty to Black Hawk. One example was the Indian Creek Massacre, triggered by settler William Davis's dam construction that blocked the Potawatomis' fish supply. Ignoring their protests, Davis even assaulted a Potawatomi man. Seizing on the turmoil, about 50 Potawatomis and 3 Sauks attacked David's settlement on May 21st, killing and mutilating 15 people. They also abducted 2 teenage girls, released weeks later by Ho-Chunk chief White Crow, who tried to placate both sides while secretly aiding the British band. And then there was the news of Stillman's Run, the Indian Creek Massacre, and all the other smaller attacks that were starting to spread. And it wasn't the only thing that was spreading. The panic was spreading too. Settlers flooded into Chicago, which was at the time a pretty small town actually, all seeking refuge. Many Potawatomis also fled there, hoping to avoid suspicion as hostiles. Elsewhere, frightened settlers had hastily erected makeshift forts and formed their own militia units, bracing for future violence. After Stillman's defeat on May 14th, American regulars and militia pressed upriver in search of Black Hawk. But morale plummeted when they just couldn't find him anywhere. No word. And no one was really telling them. Many militiamen deserted upon hearing about raids back home. They went out to defend their home, and then they found out their home had been robbed. Well, what exactly are they defending now? Governor Reynolds let his officers vote on continuing. General Whiteside, disgusted by his troops' performance, broke a tie in favor of disbandment. Most of his brigade mustered out at Ottawa on May 28th, though about 300 men, including Abraham Lincoln, by the way, agreed to stay an extra 20 days until new forces were raised. In June of 1832, General Henry Atkinson formed the Army of the Frontier, consisting of about 3,200 mounted militia and over 600 regulars, though only about 2,100 militia and 450 regulars were ready for field operations. Brigadier Generals James D. Henry, Milton Alexander, and Alexander Posey led the militia brigades. More militiamen served outside this core force. Henry Dodge, a Michigan territorial colonel, led a mounted battalion of up to 250 men. Total militia participation remains unclear, but estimates do range between 6,000 and 7,000 from Illinois alone. Abandoning the earlier policy to prevent intertribal warfare, Atkinson recruited Dakotas, Menominees, and some Ho-Chunks, eager to fight the British band. By June 6th, Agent Joseph M. Street had assembled around 225 native warriors at Prairie du Chien, nominally commanded by William S. Hamilton, who was, by the way, Alexander Hamilton's son. These allied forces soon tired of his leadership, though, and mostly went their own way, though some Menominee scouts did stay. Learning Atkinson was raising an army, Black Hawk deployed raiding parties in June of 1832, likely aiming to draw attention away from his Lake Koshkonong camp. On June 14th, about 30 warriors killed and scalped 4 farmers near present-day South Wayne, Wisconsin, marking the war's first major attack in that area. Colonel Henry Dodge responded by gathering 29 mounted volunteers who pursued the raiders. On June 16th, Dodge's men trapped 11 natives at Pecatonica River Bend, killing and scalping them, all in a brief fight. Dubbed the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, that is the word, of course, Pecatonica, it was the first notable American victory in the war, restoring public faith in the militia. Finally, some good news. And that same day, another clash occurred at Kellogg's Grove in modern Stevenson County, Illinois, where American forces were blocking raids. A militia unit led by Adam W. Schneider caught around 30 British band warriors, killing 6 of them at the cost of 3 militiamen. 2 days later, on June 18th, James W. Stevenson's troops fought what was likely the same group near Yellow Creek at Wadham's Grove. In a fierce melee, 5 or 6 Indians and 3 militiamen lost their lives. When raiders killed a civilian miner close to the Michigan Territory village of Blue Mounds on June 6th, locals started to worry that the Rock River Ho-Chunks would actually join the conflict. The settler fort at Blue Mounds was attacked on June 20th by a Ho-Chunk raiding party that one eyewitness claimed it numbered up to 100 warriors. The attack claimed the lives of 2 militiamen, one of whom was severely disfigured. About 200 warriors, including Black Hawk himself, launched an attack on the hurriedly built Apple River Fort, June 24th, 1832, close to what is now Elizabeth, Illinois. Alerted to Black Hawk's approach, local settlers sought safety in the fort, which was guarded by roughly 20 to 35 militiamen. The duration of the Battle of the Apple River Fort was only about 45 minutes. Under Elizabeth Armstrong's leadership, the girls and women inside the fort molded bullets and loaded muskets. Black Hawk broke off the siege, pillaged the neighboring houses, and returned to his camp after losing a number of men. On June 25th, Black Hawk's group came across a militia battalion under Major John Demont's command. Black Hawk's warriors forced the militiamen into their fort and began a 2-hour siege during the Second Battle of Kellogg's Grove. Black Hawk ended the siege and went back to his main camp at Lake Koshkonong after losing 9 warriors and killing 5 militiamen. This would turn out to be Black Hawk's final military triumph in the conflict. Of course, he didn't know that yet, but the tide was about to turn. He made the decision to lead his band back across the Mississippi since they were running low on food. Dissatisfied with Atkinson's management of the war, President Andrew Jackson named General Winfield Scott to assume command on June 15, 1832. At that same time, a cholera outbreak had swept across eastern North America. Scott assembled roughly 950 soldiers from army posts in the east, But they began to contract cholera as they crossed the Great Lakes from Buffalo, New York, to Chicago by steamboat, and, well, many of them did not make it. Soldiers abandoned their posts, and the sick were dumped wherever the ships landed. By the time the final steamboat touched down in Chicago, Scott had lost about 350 of his soldiers. Scott started a hasty march then, westward, on July 29th, ahead of his men, eager to assume command of what would undoubtedly be the last campaign of the war. But he would arrive too late to witness any action. You see, General Atkinson hoped to successfully conclude the war prior to Scott's arrival, after learning in early July that he would be taking command. However, part of the reason that the Americans had trouble finding the British band was because local Native Americans had given them false information. In Illinois, the Ho-Chunks and Potawatomis, many of whom would wish to stay neutral during the conflict, had actually chose to work with the Americans. Tribal leaders hoped that a high-profile display of support for the Americans would deter U.S. officials from punishing the tribes after the war was over, since they knew that some of their warriors had helped the British band. Atkinson's army was led by Ho-Chunks and Potawatomis, who wore white headbands to set themselves apart from the hostile natives. Atkinson was actually misled by Ho-Chunks, who sympathized with the predicament of Black Hawk's people, into believing that the British band was still at Lake Koshkonong. The British band had indeed moved miles to the north, while Atkinson's men were slogging through the swamps and running low on supplies, not to mention morale. Billy Caldwell's Potawatomis were also able to show their support for the Americans without engaging in combat. And then we come to Pierre Paquette, a Memetist trader, who informed Colonel Dodge in the middle of July that the British band was encamped close to the Rock River Rapids, which are now in Hustisford, Wisconsin. On July the 15th, Dodge and James D. Henry left Fort Winnebago to pursue. As the military drew closer, the British band, now down to less than 600 members from death and desertion, made their way to the Mississippi River. Several native survivors were killed and scalped by the Americans as they chased after them. That's right, the Americans were doing plenty of scalping of their own. You give as good as you get. So the British band was overtaken by the militiamen on the 21st of July, 1832, close to what is now Sauk City, Wisconsin. Black Hawk and Neapope engaged the Americans in a rearguard action that became known as the Battle of Wisconsin Heights in order to buy time for the non-combatants to cross the Wisconsin River. Black Hawk led roughly 50 Sauks and 60 to 70 Kickapoos against 750 militiamen. Of course, more than a little outnumbered. The militiamen won the battle by a lopsided margin, killing up to 68 of Black Hawk's fighters while only losing one man of their own. Much of the British band, including many women and children, were able to escape across the river as a result of the battle despite the high death toll. A difficult military operation that impressed some U.S. officials was Black Hawk's ability to repel a much larger force while allowing the majority of his people to escape. Well, either way, the Battle of Wisconsin Heights, chalk it up to an American victory. A few days after the battle, Atkinson and the regulars joined the volunteers. On July 27th, the Americans crossed the Wisconsin River and resumed their pursuit of the British band with a force of roughly 400 regulars and 900 militia. Due to the burden of injured soldiers and starving people, the British band was moving slowly. The trail of dead bodies, abandoned equipment, and the remains of horses that the ravenous natives had consumed was followed by the Americans. A messenger from Black Hawk had yelled to the militiamen following the Battle of Wisconsin Heights that the starving British band was returning across the Mississippi and would not be fighting any more. However, with no Ho-Chunk guides to interpret this message, nobody in the American camp knew what on earth he was saying. After the Battle of Wisconsin Heights, Black Hawk might have thought that the Americans had received the message and were simply not pursuing him anymore. It seems that he thought the Americans would leave his band unharmed when they crossed the Mississippi again. But the Americans were not going to allow them to get away that easily, or indeed at all. While American allied Dakotas, Menominees, and Ho-Chunks guarded the banks, the Warrior, a steamboat equipped with an artillery piece, patrolled the Mississippi River. When the Warrior reached the Bad Axe River mouth on August the 1st, the Dakotas assured the Americans that they would locate Black Hawk's people. Black Hawk attempted to surrender by raising a white flag, but it's possible that his meaning was misinterpreted. The Americans believed that the Indians were setting up an ambush with the white flag because they were unwilling to accept a surrender anyway. They started shooting as soon as they were positive that the Native Americans on the land were the British band they were looking for. The gunfight claimed the lives of 23 natives and wounded only one soldier from the other side. Black Hawk made the decision to join the Ojibways in the north for safety after the Warrior departed. Wabokioshek was among the 50 or so people who consented to accompany him. The others stayed behind, intent on crossing the Mississippi and going back to Sauk territory. Black Hawk found out that the American army had surrounded the British band members attempting to cross the Mississippi the following morning, August 2nd, as he was traveling north. After a skirmish with American troops close to what is now Victory, Wisconsin, he abandoned his attempt to rejoin the main body. Later, Black Hawk and Wabokioshek came under fire from the Sauk chief Wiki for deserting the people in the war's last battle. After the Americans caught up to the remaining members of the British band a few miles downstream from Bad Axe River mouth, the Battle of Bad Axe started around 9 a.m. on August 2nd. By this point, the British band had actually shrunk to about 500 members, including 150 warriors, while the native non-combatants desperately attempted to cross the river. The warriors engaged in combat with the Americans, and the steamboat Warrior, the one with that big old artillery piece, returned at noon with regulars and Menominees who were allied with the Americans dislodging many who had managed to reach one of the two nearby islands. With only 14 men lost, including one Menominee, who was killed by friendly fire and buried with honors alongside U.S. soldiers, the Americans won the battle by a landslide again. The British band lost at least 260 members, including roughly 110 who perished in the water while attempting to cross the river. Although the regular soldiers of the U.S., many of the militiamen killed native non-combatants on purpose, sometimes in cold blood, despite the Army's general efforts to prevent these unnecessary deaths. More of a massacre than anything. Well, I suppose you could call any one-sided battle a massacre. Either way, arriving too late for the battle were Green Bay Menominees, who had organized a battalion of almost 300 men. General Scott sent 100 of them after a portion of the British band had escaped on August 10th because they were upset about missing the opportunity to fight their old enemies. Chief Grizzly Bear maintained that the Menominees could not be forced to take any scalps, despite the advice of Indian agent Samuel C. Stambaugh, who accompanied them. Only 2 of the roughly 10 Sauks the group found were warriors. The women and children were spared, but the warriors were killed and scalped by the Menominees. In addition to arriving too late to take part in the Battle of Bad Axe, the Dakotas, who had offered 150 warriors to fight the Sauks and Meskwakes, pursued the British band members who managed to cross the Mississippi into Iowa. They attacked the remaining members of the British band along the Cedar River on or around August 9th in the war's last battle, killing 68, capturing 22. Additionally, Ho-Chunks hunted down British band survivors, capturing 50 to 60 scalps in the process. 77 settlers, militiamen, and regular soldiers lost their lives in the Black Hawk War. The cholera deaths that General Winfield Scott's relief force experienced are, of course, not included in this number. And then there is the 450 to 600 members of the British band who are thought to have perished in the battle, which accounts for roughly half of the 1,100 individuals who joined Black Hawk in Illinois in 1832. Now, a number of politically aspirational American men, of course, served in this war. 7 or more future U.S. senators actually participated, as did 2 future U.S. presidents, Taylor and Lincoln, as well as 4 future governors of Illinois, Michigan, Nebraska, and the Wisconsin Territory. American officials learned from the Black Hawk War that fighting a mounted enemy requires mounted troops. Throughout the conflict, the U.S. only mounted soldiers in the army that were volunteers who served on a part-time basis. There was no official cavalry unit. The Mounted Ranger Battalion, commanded by Henry Dodge, was established in Congress following the war and became the 1st Cavalry Regiment of the United States in 1833. So, as for Black Hawk, well, him and 19 other British band leaders were imprisoned at Jefferson Barracks by the end of the war. In the months that followed, well, the majority of the inmates were released. However, in April of 1833, Black Hawk, Wabokieshek, Neapope, and 3 other inmates were moved to Fort Monroe in Virginia, which had better prisoner storage facilities. The captured natives were eagerly viewed by the American public. They passed in front of sizable crowds in Cincinnati and Louisville. Before being transported to Fort Monroe, the prisoners had a brief meeting with President Jackson in Washington, D.C. on April 26th. They received celebrity treatment, even while incarcerated. Before they were released, a dinner was hosted in their honor, and they posed for portraits by artists like John Wesley Jarvis and Charles Byrd King. Either way, after a few weeks, the American officials had made this decision to free the prisoners. But first, the Native Americans had to travel to a number of these major East Coast cities. When Native American leaders traveled to the East, they frequently employed this strategy because it was believed to be showcasing the United States' might and size and would be a deterrence to future opposition to its expansion, you see. Black Hawk and his friends were taken on this grand tour of New York City, Philadelphia, and Baltimore starting on June 4th, 1833. They saw a battleship, several public buildings, and a military parade in addition to attending dinners and plays. Large crowds came to gawk at them. One favorite was Whirling Thunder, Black Hawk's reportedly quite handsome son. But unfortunately, the response in the West was less hospitable. One mob actually burned and hung Indian effigies as the prisoners passed through Detroit on their way home. Not the welcome that they were hoping for. Perhaps with that image of the burning effigies, we may put out the light of this video for today. Well, thank you very much for watching. What a pleasure to talk about one of those wars that no one really talks about too often. A little more Native American history coming up, that's for sure. Hope you enjoyed it. Now I'm going to thank the top-tier supporters and patrons: Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, and Sarah. Thank you very much, everyone. And I will see you in the next exciting video. Lots of love to you all, as always. Good night, and farewell.